In the name of God, peace be upon you all. We are very sorry in the beginning for some technical problems that happened, and we have been trying to solve. But now we have all the speakers with us. As you know, this is the third symposium in a series of symposia that we are holding to study the experience of Islamic movements in governance. The first symposium was in the first week of January about Sudan. Then the second symposium at the end of January was about Egypt, and today we are meeting again to discuss the experience of Al-Nahda movement in Tunisia in governance and politics. In the coming 3 days, today, tomorrow, and after tomorrow, we will have 5 sessions and around 15 speakers. This series that is conducted by SIGA is one of the most important studies that we have conducted in the past 5 years, because we are trying to make a deep analysis of these Islamic movements, especially that so many of them were the first or the top or the most important movements in the political life that made change in the social life or the political life. This is the first session about the Tunisian experience, and we have 3 speakers. It is under the title "The Movement," which means Al-Nahda movement and the state. The 3 speakers will be Hassan bin Hassan from Qatar University, and Mr. Ajami Lurimi, and he is from the Executive Office of Al-Nahda and a former parliamentarian, and Dr. Sahbi Al-Atiq. He is also a former parliament, he is a current parliament member. And these 3 speakers will be followed by 2 comments. The first by Dr. Ahmad Oysal from the Middle East Studies Center, and Dr. Zuhair Ismail. I'm going to briefly introduce those speakers who are joining us today. Dr. Hassan bin Hassan is a former consultant for the academic research in Qatar University, and he is a researcher in sociology, and he is an author of the interpreting theory, and he also has a research about terrorism and other movements, and he is also a lecturer in Qatar University and member of several academic committees. Mr. Al-Ajmi Lurimi, he has the professorship from the Literature University, and he is a lecturer in the Humanities and Social Studies University in Tunisia, and he has a number of political studies and research and the scores of opinion articles. He participated in training courses and qualification courses in several institutions in different topics in media, communication, security, and democracy monitoring in the National Council of Defense. And he is also a member of the founding council of Al-Nahda movement for several years, and he is a member of the executive office, and he is also assigned with the strategic plan. He was also a member of the parliament in the 2019, in the session of 2019. The third speaker is Dr. Sahbi Al-Atiq. He has a PhD in humanities, and his PhD thesis is about the purposes of Islam and the current or modern issues, and he has a professorship from the Tunisian University of the origins of Islam, and he has a lot of writings about interpretation and the purpose of Islam and the thought of Ibn Ashur. He was also a member of the founding council in 2018, and he is a member of the executive office of Al-Nahda movement, and he was assigned a different organizational, administrative, and ideological positions for several years within the movement, and he was also a former political detainee for several years. The 3 speakers will be followed by two commentators. The first will be by Dr. Ahmad Oysal. Dr. Ahmad is the head of the Middle East Studies or SAM Center in Ankara, and he is a professor specialized in sociology, and he is experienced in the Turkish-Arab relations. He was a lecturer in a different Turkish universities, and now he is a professor in the Istanbul University in Istanbul. He has a number of books that he has written in the fields of sociology and politics. The second commentator will be Mr. Zuhair Ismail, and he is a graduate of Susa University of teaching methods, and he taught in high institutes and universities in Tunisia, and he is also the head of the Al Jumhuriya Center for Studies and Research in 2012, and he was an advisor to the President Al Marzouqi, and he is now working in Al Manwal Center for Political Studies. And he's preparing a PhD thesis on the discourse of the Jahili poetry. We welcome you all, and as we said, it will be about the movement and the state. The first paper will be for Dr. Hassan bin Hassan, and under the title "The Theoretical Framework and Its Political Vision in the Thoughts of Al-Ghanouchi." The second, it will be about the vision of the movement to this Tunisian state by Al-Ajami Lurimi, and the third will be about the movement, the revolution, Islam and the society, the role, context, and options by Dr. Sahbi Al-Atiqi. Each one will have 20 minutes, and we will start with Dr. Hassan. Dr. Hassan, the floor is yours. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most bountiful, may peace be upon you, and all the blessings and the prayers be upon the messenger Muhammad. I would like to thank SIGA for this invitation, and I am honored to be among this group of the Knights of Freedom in Tunisia. The paper is under the title "The Theoretical Framework and the Political Vision in the Thoughts of the Al-Nahda Movement," and its chairman. And I summarize the title with the Al Ghanouchi's vision and the track of Al Nahda. After a journey of 40 years of a professional political work, we can say that Al Nahda movement succeeded in building a unique school for the reform and political function. The reformist school is not limited to the details of the day-to-day performance, although important. However, it is identified by the capability to produce its political activity and its direction towards success. This reformist group is defined or identified by the options or it made and the production of knowledge, and it is also defined by the knowledge movement motors for it. For example, criticism is one of the motors that helped it. Al-Nahda movement, for example, was looking into the reasons of renewal and the grounds of work. When the springs of capabilities and the renewal are dried out, then the reformist movement will be falling. Can we today, after this long journey, to risk distinguishing the aspects and features of this school and studying its pillars and analyzing its methodology in reform and change? This is the question of this paper. Another movement amongst the a group of reform and a change in the Arab and Islamic world is a story of the renewing the Islamic movement, critical movement that can think outside the box, that was promising with new horizons, and that it has the discretion to have new ideas that can lead to success. This relative success is still being tested, and can be related to four aspects. These four aspects are the ones that help us in to understand this school. Please, anybody else who is not speaking, please mute your microphones in order not to have any noise in the background. So please mute yourselves when you are not speaking so we can hear the speaker appropriately. So the Al-Nahda movement, among the movements of a change and reform in the Arab and Islamic world, is one of the stories of the movements that was a creative, a critical, capable of thinking outside the box and the promising of a new horizons, and that was creative in collecting and bringing together the causes of success. This relative success is still under testing, and it can goes back to four factors. These four factors together, we cannot take them separately. Those four pillars together are the pillars of this school. First, basic ideological ideas that lead towards success, activism, and or efficiency, and we will see how important this pillar is briefly. The second pillar is owning key or prominent keys of historical awareness, which means to understand the human.
يعرف الوعي التاريخي بما هو الوعي بالانتماء لعصر، أي بمعنى من المعاني امتلاك
A
مفاتيح.
German philosopher spoke about that. The third pillar is the ability to learn continuously, and Al-Nahda is a movement that learns. Uh, and I'm going to talk about that, elaborate on that. The fourth one is to keep up with the functional needs. Realistic keeping up, it means that it's not perfect, but it's good enough to understand the strategic needs of the periods that it was functioning in, especially the post-revolution period. The movement and its president Rashid Al-Ghannouchi played an important role in all of that. When we say that Al-Ghannouchi participated or contributed hugely in their work in this reformist political school, it doesn't mean that all the success is attributed to him, as some people assume. The Al-Nahda movement was built with thousands of hands and hundreds of minds, because Al-Nahda movement produced dozens of thinkers, but Al-Ghannouchi contributed to making the choices of Al-Nahda choices that can be highly productive, and he contributed highly to the creation of its mindset and building its capabilities and the efficiency by which it works. So we can say that Al-Ghannouchi contributed to a large extent to the success of this school, but not all the success of this school can be attributed to him. But he was on the front lines on that job, and he contributed to uh, the groundwork of this success. And I believe this role is admitted by all the those who belong to Al Nahda, including the independent people. So the roles of Al Ghannouchi and building the pillars of this school is very obvious. If we say that Al Nahda learned since its establishment until today a lot, it doesn't mean that Al Ghannouchi is the source of all of this knowledge, or he was the only one who made that learning, but he was a prominent or a pioneer in learning lessons, although he rarely participated in the revisions or the reviews that took place within the movement. For example, right now in there is a new review that is being conducted within the movement, and Al-Ghanouchi didn't contribute to it. First, why Al-Ghanouchi and the movement? First, because there were educational choices that build the sense of responsibility within the movement, and that makes success and failure uh, a yardstick against which we can gauge the success. And it is a very important factor for the social change and the managing the political conflict. It means that for in the purposes of the Islamic Sharia, looking into the consequences of the actions is very critical, and that is the background of this. In the political works, Max Weber, the German philosopher, has a booklet. Uh, uh, it's called politician and the scientist. In that book, he differentiates between two types of morals: the moral of responsibility and the morals of the conviction. The morals of conviction, it is for people who of the thinkers and the scientists, because they should do what they are convicted or convinced to do. Whereas the politicians, sometimes if we do only what we are convinced with, it can lead to uh, catastrophic results. But the politician, when they have the responsibility, it means that they look into the consequences of the actions, even if they are not convinced about these things, because the consequences of the political actions can lead to or can affect everybody in the society. So when we speak about the uh, uh, when we are speaking about the politician, it means that this is a factor for the success of the society and serving the needs of the society. The second aspect is the deep distinguishing between the religion and being pious, because religion is the source of perfection that is revealed from Allah Himself, and that we cannot uh, criticize it whether it is a success or a failure. However, being religious or being pious is the understanding of the religion. It is, and this understanding that have levels of understanding, and uh, uh, and the practices from that religious behavior can lead to the success or the failure. The Muslim person uh, can become religious through the readings and the learning, and this learning can have different levels that affect the performance of the person. I believe that talking about the consequence or thinking about the consequences is difficult in the political action. However, undermining or looking down into that factor is not a good practice, and a lot of Islamic movements say that we are not obliged to look into the consequences, but we only can do the exert the efforts, and that's what Allah asks us to do. And this is one of the problems of the Muslim thinking. So interaction with the reality in the reformist mindset of Al-Nahda was obvious, because whether they deal well or deal badly with the reality affects their performance. The reformist vision can be successful the more it is responsive to the needs of reality. And even in the Islamic sciences, we have, for example, the Sharia sciences like the Hadith and the sciences of the Quran that are closed, and we have other sciences that are open for discretion and renewal. So we don't. Uh, we don't get it from the Islamic movement real awareness only to the extent that is acquired or needed for us for interacting with the reality. And the reality also looks into the change that requires well planning for benefiting from them. And we can get, which means that any reality, no matter how difficult it is, the reformist movements can look into it. And because the human being is a person or a creature that can understand or learn from the historical experience, so they can do that. And the reformist experience as one of the key choices that was made within the Al Nahda. So the reformist law can change as we move from one action to another, and there is no master key that fits all or that opens all the doors. That's why we need to have specializations. For example, reform in education is different from reform in economics, and the tools that we use in economic reform are different from the ones that we use in political reform, and so on and so forth. So specialization from one field to another should be made, and there is no master key for all that opens all doors, and that leads to the idea of specialization. Specialization is based on this conviction that the tools for reform should be different from one field to another. And this idea of specialization led to the separation between the da'wah aspect of the movement from the political aspect of the movement. So these are the two main pillars. So I said the first one are the cultural, educational choices that that were result oriented, and the second one was the awareness of history and the how the human being can be affected and influenced, and their performance can be changed. Al-Nahda movement looked at the freedom as a door for reforming the future, and democracy as a methodology for the people to restore their ability to work. Al-Ghanouchi was not the first one to write in democracy in the modern Islamic thought. There were great thinkers and writers before him who wrote about that, like Al-Kawakibi, Al-Banjari, and Al-Shami. However, he contributed from the front line in the detailed study of the branches of the democratic thinking in Islam, especially removing the reservation of the Islamic movement, the moderate Islamic movements about that, and facing its enemies, and practicing that in practice and in reality after the revolution with a very sound compass, as we are going to see. So, some of the keys for the historical awareness was selecting the door of freedom for the future, and the ability of the Islamic movement to absorb the modernity, which is the summary of the experience of the Western civilization with its ups and downs, its the advantages and disadvantages. In the foundation of Al-Nahda and proving itself, the criticism of the westernization and the orientation toward the West, and losing the our identity was more present. And in the later stages, Al-Nahda was more known for the receiving or learning with a critical eye from the Western civilization. Al Nahda is, of course, in that orientation, is affected by the nature of the Tunisian society, which is open society and affected with the as a Mediterranean people. So it starts to talk about the freedoms and liberties, especially the role of women in society. And Al Ghanouchi was the first one within the movement to speak about that. Nevertheless, Al Nahda, it was also linked with the Borgabian movement of modernization. And there were no serious experiences for the modernization of the society. So this is the second aspect of what I call Al Nahda school in the political action and reform. The third pillar is the ability to continuously learn. The ability of a human being to read and learn is a very important and extraordinary level in the people. And because this is the answer that Allah gave to the questions of the angels when they asked about the corrupting the earth by people when he created Adam. So they ask about the moral aspect of people. So Allah didn't say that He has high morals. He taught Adam all the names, all the words, and then He asked the angels, etc., etc., till the end of the verse. So when the angels ask about the people's corruption of earth, and this is one aspect of the human nature, but there is another aspect which is reading. When Allah Almighty told His Messenger, read in the name of your God, read and praise your God. So this aspect that was inherited by Allah to the people, which is the ability to learn, and the Nahda movement learns from its mistakes. We have a comprehensive, for example, revision in 1974, another one in 1986, another one in 1996, and another revision in the 10th conference of Al-Nahda movement. And now in the 11th conference, we are conducting another review of our works. So this is one of the aspects of Al-Nahda that we regularly criticize and learn from our mistakes, and we learn from the failures and successes of the Islamic history. So all of that is included in a detailed paper, and that is coming from the awareness of the elite of Al-Nahda movement. Al-Ghanouchi, for example, from what happened in the 90s when the Islamic Front received 100% of the votes, but the elite, who was a minority, was able to turn the table against everybody. So being aware of the divisions, the catastrophic divisions, for example, the Islamic world was divided by this factor. And also the enemy from within is another factor. So the democratization in Tunisia, and when he was, we have Dr. Samir Dilo, he is the Minister of Democratization, and he was the one who set the features of this period by the conducting transitional justice learning from the experience of other states, and having the strategic planning to face and to navigate through the different difficult periods. And as I said, Al Ghanouchi is one of the people who of the elites in the Arab and Muslim world, of strategic thinkers like Munir Shafiq, and Al Ghanouchi is one of them. So this pillar is that we are able to learn to think outside the box in different occasions, including, for example, breaking four cages of thinking. The first one is what has been inherited from the left side, from the leftist thinking, because in Tunisia the leftist thinking was trying to boycott all the former in the experience. So. Uh, and they put us in that cage, and they didn't put themselves in that cage. Uh, we also another thing that we have seen in the movement, in the reformist movement, that they didn't think about the consequences of their actions. And the third cage is the bloody utopia that usually comes with the revolutions, that think that they are going to make a complete separation or boycott of the past. And the fourth cage that we broke was the vision of the conspiracy of the entire world, and that the entire world is governed by secret brotherhoods or secret organizations, and which led to uh, preventing us, or preventing the Islamic movements from dealing with with the world and the international relations properly. You have 5 minutes left. I need two further minutes. And the other one is the civil society organizations in combating tyranny, and the importance of the external image. And now the external image of the Al Nahda movement and the democratic experience movement is a very important factor for failing the coup that is taking place in Tunisia. I believe that the learning is open, and ability to learn and succeed and influence the modern world is based on the ability to learn. Also, uh, keeping up with the needs of the different political periods. And what we are concerned about here is the post-revolution period. The post-revolution period was a new test or a new exam for the flexibility of the mindset of Al Nahda, its political creativity, and its ability to deal with the different situations it is dealing with. Actually, the Al Nahda was the backbone of the democratic transition, and it was faced with a lot of enmity from the different groups in the political spectrum, and it was also faced with the amount of capabilities provided by regional and international groups to foil the Arab Spring, especially after the coup in Egypt. So Al Nahda movement had to deal in a new mindset, or to reform it, or to form itself in a way to rationalize as a rationalization force of in a liquid political environment, which means that there was no stability, but there were capabilities, or there were opportunities for stabilization if we dealt appropriately with that. And because of the lack of a trust amongst the different that we inherited from the time of colonization, and that was charged with iconic violence from the forces that were working against the Arab Spring. uh, uh, Rationalization was finding the shortest way and the less costly to build a democratic, strong state, rich and just, and to learn from the experiences of other nations and the lessons of history. Rationalization means learning from history. These roads for the democratic transition and for building democracy are today fixed factors for democracy that were accumulated by the experiences of other nations. So we are not reinventing the wheel in this field, but we need to be aware and to understand the human experience and benefit from it. The political work is built on three factors. The first one is the ability of the executive branch of government to govern, which means empowering those who were selected by the ballot boxes to govern. And that didn't happen in the past 10 years. The second factor is the rule of law, which means no one is above the rule of law. And the rule of law includes the separation of powers and protecting the main the main liberties and the freedoms. And the third factors in a strong democracy is the political responsibility, political accountability before the monitoring bodies and the people, which means taking or holding the responsibility for all the actions or the decisions, whether they were for you or against you. And the deeply democratic states have only reached that after they went through a long journey in that way, and after having a lot of shocks. If we take the history of Al-Nahda in the post-revolution period and measure it against this history of democracies, uh, it's we will see that the result was very good, because Al Nahda showed itself as one that can lead the democratization, capable of holding responsibility for even the worst political storms, and able to understand the experience, the exams of democracy and its tools, and able to be on the forefront of the democratic forces that are transitioning to democracy. We can learn, we need to learn from the history of the well-established democracies and how they became as such. All of them started as weak democracies, and step by step they moved forward toward the democratization. So we need to have this political rationalization, to learning from those democracies and how they moved from being weak to strong, and learning from the successful democratic transition experience, which means looking and learning from history. And the real politician is the one who learns from history. The democratic transition means that we are not a unique nation in the world, and that we need to learn about the experience of other democracies that succeeded in that journey. All of the experiences that the emergent democracy in Tunisia learned, which mean, for example, from the popularist movement, the iconic violence and the propaganda, and the division within the society. All of these issues were experienced by other democracies, and they dealt with them. Of course, taking into consideration all the different context and circumstances of these worlds.
نعم معك دقيقة.
أي قريب دقيقتين أو ثلاث.
One
إذا
minute.
نظرت في كل المشاكل التي
The
عانينا منها
choices of Al Nahda, of
يجب أن
all the
نعود لهذه
problems that were experienced in this nascent democracy, is coming from the experiences of other democracies, including dealing with the wounded memory, with and how we through the tyranny, and how we dealt with that through the transitional justice, and learning or dealing with the experience with the legitimacy, and building public space or a legal framework and a moral framework for open discussions, and trying to find consensuses for agreeing on points, and the participation of and approaching a
لأنه هذا
participatory
مثل
approach to deal with everybody, and dealing with the accusations that were made falsely against Al Nahda by resorting to the judiciary. Rationalization in all of these aspects is a conflict. The rationalization is a conflict with the expressions of the non-rationalized mind. And Al Nahda took them the sound choices. We can argue about how sound or how good the choices were, but the the basic of the choice was sound and built on democracy. The counter revolution since day one was built on paralyzing the governments that came into power after the revolution, and stealing the ability of the government to make any achievement, showing its failures, mobilizing people through popularist approach, and the brain drain from our countries, and going back to the political polarization. For example, the confrontation between Al Nahda and the other political but Dr. Hassan, you have taken 32 minutes, so I gave you 7 minutes more. Okay, I'm just reading. I have just half a page left. And they worked on cutting the relations of Al Nahda and its allies, and the war against all the institutions of the states. On the other hand, Al Nahda tried to show itself to the Tunisians and the people as a power of rationalization in the political scene in Tunisia that is able to absorb the tectonic movement in the political scene, learn from the lessons. And the plan of Al Nahda was built on two aspects, which is the first was restructuring the political platform or the scene in Tunisia, and getting closer to the center of the political spectrum, and following a participatory approach. The second pillar was to prevent tyranny from going back, and protecting the nascent democracy through different tools. First, by establishing the institutions that can protect that, and the role of the judiciary to protect the judicial, the democratic track, and having independent institutions, and there was relative success. The other one is the transitional justice, and it is an iconic justice that tried to provide compensation and reparation for the victims, and to heal the wounds of the past, and to start a new chapter for the future. There was some relative success in this field. Of course, there were a lot of propaganda against that track. And the third issue is, and this is very important for Al Nahda and the nascent democratic experience in Tunisia, which is working on the external image of Al Nahda, and working on that image was very important. The fourth aspect was the issue of time, because the war or the struggle of the revolution against its enemies, it was playing on the factor of time. And we tried to build democracy culture amongst people, allowing the institutions to heal and to be on a track, and that allowed Tunisia to breathe the freedom for 10 years, and made it a little bit protected from the exclusion, the culture of exclusion. The culture was spread to a large percent of the people. In summary, was the Al Nahda movement or succeeded in the necessary after in the post-revolution? It was relatively successful because the democratization, when it came, or the coup that came, is not well formed, and it's had its roots of failure within, and the Tunisian society that will heal again, and the popular movement will quickly move towards the right track, and Al Nahda is getting back its struggle
أقول بأن الاختيارات
and come back. Finally, Dr. Hassan, there will be question and answer, and you can include things that you didn't mention. Finally, I only have 4 lines, one last paragraph.
35 دقيقة يعني
If every speaker will ask us for 50 minutes, it will be a problem. I'm very sorry, but we started late and we have less than 1 hour and a half. Thank you very much. I will summarize quickly what Dr. Hassan mentioned.
I will
After
briefly
50
summarize
years
that
of
after
40
50
years of the
years
political
of
work, Al-Nahda
political work, Nahda established its own school of thought in politics, and that it has taken certain options and was a guiding force. And because of its knowledge background, and when these resources in the reformative school dry out, we need to assess them, and we need to talk about four features of this reformative school of thought. First of all, the ideological choices, fundamentals. Second, what we called the understanding of history and the present moment. Third is the ability for constant learning and keeping abreast with the different strategic moments and phases, and that Mr. Rashid al-Nushi played a vital role in all of those features. But that doesn't mean that it was his achievement only, but that Al-Nahda was the sum total of hundreds or thousands of experienced and knowledgeable persons. One of the most important cultural choices was to create the movement dynamic and to reassess its progression, and also the differentiation between religiosity and the religious question, and also separating dawah from political questions, and that there was much awareness in those options, which allowed for much freedom and accommodation by the Islamic movement to modernism. And he said that they had an in-depth vision of the situation of women in society, the rule of law, and other questions related to modern democracy, and that Al-Nahda in different stages learned from its mistakes and improved its awareness. And he drew the example from Algeria and Egypt, and that they learned from experiences of other countries, and that this was significant, and that also they worked on transitional justice, and that the movement worked on freedom as the gate to any change in society, and that they tried to learn from the experience of the left, and as well as from any instances of negligence of outcomes, and the importance of the external image of the Islamic movement in external vision. And also he said that Islamic movements have to accommodate to strategic moments and understand the great momentum against the Arab Spring. So Al-Nahda movement in this context has become a rationalizing force that tries to look for the least costly methods to and most fruitful methods to establish a successful democratic experience. He talked about the three elements of a successful democracy, which is the executive power to rule, which did not materialize in Tunisia. Second is the rule of law and the separation of authorities or powers. And the third is political responsibility before the people, public opinion, and monitoring agencies. He said that no stability can be established without those features. Hence, Nahda has been able to shoulder this responsibility and pave the way for a successful transition. And we have to understand the experiences of many other nations in this democratic transition. And he also said that we have to address the downside of freedom by recognizing the rights and entitlements of all and accommodating for differences. So the Al-Nahda movement has used rationalization in all its approaches at all levels. He said that the movement has not made a mistake in its strategic choices, but we may agree or disagree with the detailed approach or mechanisms it used, and it tried to rationalize the political pathway to create a rupture and a divorce with the past of authoritarianism to prevent a recurrence of its authoritarianism. And he concluded talking about the importance of time, the importance of the passage of time for democratic transition to materialize. Now it's time to give the floor for the second, our second speaker, Dr. Ajami. Thank you, Dr. Sami. I'd like to greet you all and all the participants. Thank you for allowing me to take part in thinking out loud about the situation, the current situation and future of the Islamic movement. My paper is called Al-Nahda and the State. That's the geopolitical framework of Islamic movement and the local framework. I can't hear you, Doctor. Dr. Ajmi, are you speaking on the Arabic channel? Yes. We can hear him on the Arabic channel.
إذا ما سمعت ممكن تذهب إلى اللايف ستريمينج على يوتيوب.
If you can't hear him, you can go to the live stream on YouTube, but mute your Zoom to listen from there. The Al-Nahda is peculiar because it belongs to the country in which the Arab Spring started, and it is the movement that tried to reconcile with the state without being the party that called for this, but rather it was a mutual as well as a popular demand and a historical necessity and a strategic need for the state without consensus among the elite about in terms of reconciliation. But the elite rather has always shed suspicion on the ability of Al-Nahda to understand and accommodate for modernism and trying to be coercive in terms of imposing their traditions on the Tunisian people. But in practice, Al-Nahda movement has turned out to be the party most capable of adapting adapting its approach and in managing the transition from an authoritarian state, a police state, to a democratic, open state. And despite the irony, the West has expected Al-Nahda, which is an Islamic movement, to provide the first example of a democratic state in the Arab world. And this would have probably given fruit had it not been for the troubled path of Egypt, Libya, and Syria. And when those counter-revolution approaches failed through terrorism, terrorist attacks, and through external targeting and the rhetoric against the revolution from outside, and also all the attempts to sabotage the pathway to ratify the constitution, it would have given fruit. Islam, which has been absented from the international arena after having been the most important power in geopolitics and between which moves between war and peace and with the different expansions. The Islam which has been absented is no longer a single civilizational civilization, but it holds the remnants of its historical role under international hegemony, which it tries to establish justice. But Islam has become in the background, and it has lost its position in the leadership, and this gradual regression was not recognized by Muslims as a point for revival and an opportunity. So it eroded as a reason of unity, and one of the most manifest features of this regression was the fall of the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of the 20th century, when the Islamic Empire was no longer a single civilizational power or a military power, but they became what remained of that historic power. And our world became a satellite in a world led by so-called West, trying to break free from this Western hegemony, which regards Islam as a threat led by the Judeo-Christian powers and rhetoric, which have replaced Islamic conquest.
وغير مؤهلة لمقاومة روحية وعسكرية للغرب المتمدن والمحكوم بروح الظفر والمدجج بسلاح السيطرة والإبادة العرقية والثقافية لا يرى في
the West, which is very well armed with its cultural as well as military tools, has preyed on this part of the world. But despite all the resistance at the time, the Ottoman Empire failed and fell, and all Islamic movements failed to revive that dead empire, but they continued to move forward, sometimes going back to their Islamic prototype and other times echoing Western values, so much so that the Islamic movement has become in itself conflicted in terms of its terms of reference, and some of those have become called as political Islam, which covers a nebula of Islamic movements who are trying to combine between Islamic terms of reference and political practice, despite the fragmentation, which is the legacy of the colonization, particularly in the presence of Israel and international powers. And because Islam was not is instinctive and is inherent in our very nature, not just a religion imposed on people. Hence, the revival and reformist movements calling for social reform and morality and resistance and building. They started.
لو تبطئ قليلا بس عشان المترجمين شويه.
نعم الله يبارك. قلت فقد استلهمت حركات.
Please speak slowly for the translators. Those have used the terms of reference of Islam with its social understanding and its morality, justice, has become the source of energy for building and construction, so much so that at the dawn of the third millennium, it became a geopolitical actor and an important player in the world within the international system and world order, whose components call for an achieving equilibrium and a balance of power to achieve stability. But so-called civilized world is not only governed by values and negotiations, particularly that the Islamic world has the most important wealth and resources around the world. Hence, this is used to deplete the historic resources of the Islamic world. Some Islamic parties, and here I'm talking about Al-Nahda in Tunisia, had to declare themselves as civil parties and under the conservative banner, not as part of the political Islam with its historical connotation, but as part and parcel of the rule of law in modern states, to keep that safe distance from the other components or with the other components of the Islamic background, to distance themselves from the image of incompetent Islamic movements in order to introduce Islam as an important player, even if at a limited scale, as an important geopolitical actor that cannot be subjected to international powers, but that can subject its own momentum for reconciliation and coexistence in a world where there remains very little room for the good and for all message shared by all faiths. We cannot imagine the relation between the Al-Nahda and the state without the context of authoritarianism, and also after revolution we cannot imagine that relation without the context of building democracy. And between these two historical eras, the Al-Nahda changed from an opponent member to a leader. Hence, now we have passed 10 years of political and democratic construction as well as political participation. And these are years in which Al-Nahda normalized its relations with the state and reconciled in a state that reconciled in an unprecedented manner with its people, using the approach which was gradual on three phases. First of all, the higher commission for the goals of revolution. The second is the drafting of the constitution, and the third is building constitutional institutions and enacting the constitution. During those phases, over 10 years have seen around 10 different governments and have been unable to achieve an economic miracle in which they would break free from the economic crisis, and they had to face the continuous developmental gap, the budget deficit, the decline in purchasing power, the increasing unemployment rates, and the imbalance between formal and informal sectors, in addition to the rampant corruption as well as the troubled political arena in which the democracy building was unable to continue concurrently with development and economic development. So development remained lacking because of those many attempts to fail it. The counter-revolution talk about those 10 years as 10 years of failure, despite and they look at the state as gain, and they see no way to regain power and regain momentum unless they eliminate Al-Nahda and the Islamic movement and undo all the achievements over the past 10 years, including decentralization, the modified parliamentary system, and the electoral law and coalition-based government. Hence, we see that the relation with the state has become at the center of debate and at the center of disagreement, and this disagreement hides the or covers the dispute between the political parties which are trying to take over power in an undemocratic manner, since they are unable to take it over through by democratic means. As the current system and electoral law does not provide the which opened the floor for extortion of the majority by the minority and undermine the stability despite the abidance with the electoral law and democratic principles. Nonetheless, the opposition insisted on modifying the system to presidential system rather than parliamentary, and by centralizing power in the hands of the president after it was made under very high monitoring, and this was at the expense of development and giving actual attention in the actual needs.
يصف بعض الباحثين الثورة التونسية.
Some scholars describe the Tunisian revolution as a conservative revolution, and saying that the revolution did not totally demolish the older structures, but tried to do a gradual transformation and to modify and amend the constitution, i.e., they got rid of Ben Ali and then gradually dismantled the system in order to create an alternative democratic governance system that eliminates exclusion, particularly in alliance with the Tunisian army, which took the side of the people, and then they moved to the election of council and worked on balanced development and sharing of power. And Nahda was one of the locomotives for this change and callers for this change, and they were trying to stop any slipping back to autocracy. And that's why the Al-Nahda used this approach of gradual reconciliatory change, which made it look like non-revolutionary, and they labeled it as the shaking hands. And this actually made many people criticize it, particularly when the left did not support Al-Nahda and were counting on the failure of Al-Nahda in governing the state, particularly given the corruption, extortion, and also counting on the suspicion and fears of the West from the rise of political Islam, particularly in France, and from the hostility towards political Islam elsewhere in the region. In 2011, the Tunisian people translated the importance of reconciling Islam with the democratic demands and the separation of powers, power devolution and circulation, comprehensive development, local governance. And when those ideas were accepted by all parties under the constitution, that historical settlement was only provisional, after which political actors came back to dispute not over those demands, but over the relation with the state and the positioning of the state of the country within regional and international contexts, which was volatile in itself with the fierce rivalry on influence. And the elections was one of the points in which the constitution was put at stake, and a political crisis in which the political evolution was not complete, and the divorce with powers of actors are informed by ideologies and by other affiliations was not complete, and this was reflected with the rise of populist movements and counter-revolution, which were very critical towards the al-Nahda and the political and populism, culminated in the winning of Qais Said in the presidency, and also with the winning of the Dignity Coalition and the other party, which were the remnants of the old regime and have become a parliamentary arm for the president of the republic. And those were the tools of confrontation between systems that do not work for coexistence and the respect of constitution and the persistence of the state, but to move governance towards a new structure in which the weight and power is moved from the people and the state of law to a police state and the presidential authoritarian system, instead of building a just social state. You have 4 minutes left.
نعم تفضل.
نعم لحظة أستاذ. وقد الصوت مسموع.
Can you hear me? Yes, we can. We had powers with affiliations beyond our borders to powers that are against the revolution, infiltrated into our political system and our partisan system, and they seized the opportunity to re-establish dictatorship and establish a coup against democracy in this historical phase in which the presidency will ally with counter-democratic forces to eliminate the gains of the revolution, particularly the constitution, the parliament, and all constitutional institutions, in the absence of any monitoring or arbitration due to the absence of the constitutional court. The present contemporary Islamic movement in Tunisia was established in a context in which much of the community and much of the political powers moved towards the West, and Al-Nahda moved on in those two battles, democratic change as well as the civilizational question before the revolution, which was the pioneer, the leader of the Arab Spring revolutions in the demands for development, dignity, and freedom. From resisting authoritarianism to building a democracy. For decades, Al-Nahda had different chapters of resistance against Bourguiba and Bil Ali eras, and this is testified to by the many trials and arrests against its figures and against its project of liberation. And Al-Nahda paid dearly through its members for their lives and their reputation for their cause without letting go despite and holding fast to their values and Islamic backgrounds. The West, although the West itself was implicated in supporting autocracies and taking sides with certain political powers at the expense of the mass majority, and so much so that those mass majority became the first and foremost interested in change, and hence we had the revolution of December 2010, which led the path to democracy in the Arab Spring. Al-Nahda faced its greatest channel by folding the page of authoritarianism and starting and embarking on a major revision of national options and building the democracy and dismantling authoritarianism and exclusion. It was a strategic option in order to access a modernist political order in Tunisia. This required Al-Nahda, the greatest Islamic movement in Tunisia, to overcome all the terms of reference of the older authority or the past power, autocratic powers, and to overcome all the institutions without sacrificing its political path and its political approach and its position of community. The 9th and 10th conferences translated this new approach. After this movement became a party to governance. Mr. Ajmi, can you summarize in 1 minute? Yes, I am in the last paragraph actually. The challenges that face Al-Nahda. Al-Nahda should have, which has come to consider itself one of the Islamic movements that is a bit different from political Islamic movements. It should have proven the lack of conflict or the absence that there is no conflict between Islam and governance, and to be open to other movements and to reconcile with disagreeing or rival powers, including by establishing coalition governments. This experience has shown its limits and its promises in the historical context, and Al-Nahda, with the available conditions, was influenced and made an influence on the Tunisian context, which is eager for to embrace its own Islamic culture. To conclude, the democratic path received a blow from the coup of Qais Said in 2020 as a relapse from the democratic path, and it was a great present to the deep state from autocracy. So it became, after being the exception, it was derailed from the constitutional pathway through what he named as the revolutionary option by an establishing and calling for a broad front to confront this coup based on the shared values, assessing and correcting the past and not repeating past mistakes. Since the time of establishment and even in other eras, the Islamic nation was prevented from being the perfect or complete nation, despite its religion being the perfect and most complete. And that was made through manipulating demographics and other features, and by although Islam calls for a just world recognizing all differences and embracing a human dignity. And although we have relapsed to square one, but the fact that Al-Nahda has come
that can be part of the struggle of civilizations, and in order to get back to the balance of powers. So Al-Nahda movement has its responsibility to get back to play its role, and in order to make it a geopolitical power that can play its role as a power for the good of humanity, that is inevitable to renew itself and to start radical renovation in order to get into a new world. Thank you very much. And the historic opportunity of the Arab Spring brings us close to this in order so the citizenship state will not be a failed state, and that the project of revolution is not a failed experience, because that will brings us back and it will be very costly. This is the test that the Islam and the Islamic movement should prove themselves in. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Al-Ajmi. He spoke about the fighting tyranny, moving to
تونس كانت هي أولى
democracy.
حركات
This was the title
ثورات الربيع
of
العربي
the paper, and he said that Tunisia was the first in the Arab Spring revolutions, and the political development was not the Al-Nahda didn't want to go to reconciliation, but it responded to that invitation. The experience shows that Al-Nahda was the one of the political movements that wanted to move to from tyranny to democracy, taking into consideration maintaining the Islamic background, and the Islamic movement, or the Islamic political Islam movement, where was the first one speaking about the national state or citizenship state, because Islam started to be away from the state, and the world became a globalized world. Islam lost its historical role by the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and the world started to see Islam in a negative lens. If the Islam was capable to fight the being attached to the West, which has always been dealing with Islam in a vengeance. The Islamic movements or the Islamic community was divided amongst the different the Islamic groups, but with the current with the modern world, the Islamic movement started to play a balancing role with these struggle, but they got into struggle with regional groups that are affiliated to the West. That made Al-Nahda movement a group that is calling for reconciling with the modernist, with the modernity, not necessarily with the modernist state. And then in the revolution, Al-Nahda was fighting tyranny, and the post-revolution, it was the movement that was holding the issue of democracy. Before the revolution, Al-Nahda was part of the opposition. After the post-revolution, it was part of the political actors in governance, and it became a democratic, participatory, integrating movement, and it went into three phases. The first one was ending tyranny. The second one was writing the constitution and then building the constitutional institutions. There were 10 governments that were unable to bring the community or the state out of its socio-economic problems or building the democracy and other institutions, but there were discourse of the counter revolution that wanted to exclude the movement and all of the gains that were made in the society, like the multi-party society or the parliamentarian system. These counter-revolution forces want to bring back tyranny through empowering the executive force. Some people say that the Tunisian revolution was a conservative one. It was not radical. It didn't eliminate the former regime because the choice of the movement, the strategic choice was to make reforms, constitutional reforms, and build constitutional institutions, and they followed that path, unlike the or against the will of some Western powers, including France, and that was a step for the current, leading to the current political crisis with the populist movements that want to create this division between the state and the society, which led to the rise of the populist groups, like the current president, and having the rise of those movements, as well as the rise of the revolutionist groups. The counter-revolution wants to control institutions and bring back the police state and the dictatorship. The current president and his allies are doing that, especially with the absence of the constitutional Supreme Court. Al-Nahda is a model of fighting tyranny, and members of the Al-Nahda, thousands of them were detained, tortured, and resisted to defend this model, which accumulated or was crowned by the revolution of 2011. And then they are trying to normalize the relations with the states, build the constitutions, constitutional institutions, and to move forward to democracy. There were a lot of mistakes, and that should have proved that the movement is not contradicting with Islam, but governance has a lot of challenges. But Al-Nahda has always maintained its strategic choice, which is building a civil state, as he said, as he quoted, a SIPSI for a Muslim society. And the current constitutional dictatorship that the current president is trying to affect in the country is moving away from democracy, and we should fight that. And the Al-Nahda movement has always been fighting for justice, citizenship, and a future of a civilized future. Thank you very much, Mr. Al-Ajami. And now we move to the third paper, and I hope the speaker can commit to the time allocated, Dr. Sahbi Atiq. And in his paper about the movement, the revolution, Islam and the society, the role, context, and choices. Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and peace and blessings be upon the Prophet Muhammad. Thank you, Dr. Sami, and I would like to thank all the attendees. I would like to thank SIGA for this invitation. First, speaking about oneself is difficult, but the Quran informs us to be just and fair when we speak, and I hope that I will be as objective as possible to provide an honest paper for the topic of this symposium. I will speak about the movement in relation with the revolution and the movement in relation with the its ideological background, which is Islam, and the relation of the movement with the society. Uh, I have a brief introduction. I said that the Arab scholar lived in uh, large periods of dictatorship or tyranny, political and social tyranny. The Arab world didn't know a lot the experience of good governance, the separation of powers, the independence of judiciary, all of these topics, all of these all of these environments led to the revolution in Tunisia. The revolution in Tunisia surprised everyone, all the political parties or the political actors in Tunisia, and all the regional and international actors. The revolution didn't have a leader and it didn't have a certain political party. But in this revolution, and this revolution didn't have any ideological or partisan slogans. So that means the revolution was not expected. It was launched by a vendor, and that was caused some of the reasons of the or the causes of the revolution. In addition to the political tyranny, there are socio-economic reasons. Then the political classes joined the revolution. The revolution included a lot of young people, and those young people were brave and cooperating with each other through social media. They had a very important role in doing that. After this revolution, or this revolution was the opening for the what become to be known as the Arab Spring. So it started in Tunisia, and it was a revolution against corruption, uh, tyranny, exclusion, marginalization, poverty, and the violation of basic rights. The main question is, what is the role of Al-Nahda movement in this revolution? There are three main lines here. First, this blessed revolution was because of the accumulation of years of struggle against tyranny. This struggle was made by Islamists, leftists, nationalists, trade union members. All of that struggle led to this revolution. There were several socio-economic and political causes that led to this revolution. The most important of these factors, the suppression of rights, not allowing Islamist nationalists or leftists to act politically. There was an uprooting attempts of all Islamists in Tunisia. Al-Nahda movement was not allowed to function freely. And in 1981, 84, 87, then 19 and 91, 90 and 91, there were huge suppressions of the movement. In addition to that, the corruption and the widespread corruption in the country, and also attacking civil society organizations and narrowing down on their work. The spread of tyranny also was very obvious at the time, which led to the increase to the revolution and the increase of unemployment. There were political parties that are well structured, and they had a long history of a struggle. Although those parties were not very strong, but they responded quickly to the revolution. In addition to a very important organization, which is the Tunisian Labor Trade Union, or the collective of the trade unions. This is a very strong and it has a lot of members. There are other civil society organizations, including human rights organizations, that are struggling against tyranny and fighting for the rights for human rights. So very quickly, the false image that Ben Ali was trying to show about justice and development and the freedom and the human rights was exposed, and he escaped the country in the face of a people that was calling for social justice and freedom. As I said, some of the strong points: not having leaders of the revolution and not to having a specific ideology, the presence of the young people, and the revolution was united with the main forces of the country, and the non-violence or the peacefulness of the revolution. There was no arms that were used other than from the side of the state against the people. So we didn't have any civil war like Libya or any armed conflict. So the main feature of the revolution was the that it was a peaceful revolution. And then the position of the Tunisian army. The Tunisian army protected this revolution. The Tunisian army could have took power, but it protected the revolution until we had the higher council that led the elections in the country. They had a very important role for the for the democratic transition. It was a semi legislature or legislative council. It was established for supervising the democratic track and the conducting the political and constitutional reforms. This was issued by virtue of a decree issued by the interim president. It included more than 11 trade unions as well as a number of independent figures from all the spectrum of the political spectrum in Tunisia. So this council is the one that brought back elections. Then it it also drafted some laws that are related to the political life, like the party laws and uh, uh, political and media aspects. And it was the council that supervised the first free and fair elections in Tunisia. So it has a very important role, and it paved the way for the elections, regardless of what mistakes that took place at the time. I believe Al-Nahda during the revolution or the Al-Nahda during the Bourqiba faced a lot of problems, but it led to the fail of Bourqiba's regime, but it wasn't allowed to work freely. Although it changed its name from the Islamic name to Al-Nahda, the authority of Ben Ali tried to eliminate or uproot the project of the Al-Nahda and eliminate its organizational presence after the elections, and the presence or its popular support started to appear in the elections of 1989, and that was a very critical point with the relation of the Ben Ali regime. This period was only 2 years and a half from 1987, from 1978, sorry, 87 to the end of 90, the year 1990. This struggle or that period led to hundreds and thousands of detainees, orphans, widows, and tortured people and disabled people. Al-Nahda movement was able to prove itself as a civil, peaceful movement that is trying to have a role in politics despite all the confrontation that it was facing and the injustice it was paid for against, and all the problems that the regime of Ben Ali made led to the revolution against it. This movement, because of the suffering and because of the detention of its members, the uh, security scrutiny and surveillance against it made the movement weak and exhausted. But the people was attached to it because of its moral position and the moral higher grounds, because of its attempt to reach justice and reform. The movement was popular amongst the neighborhoods and the poor quarters in the city. And there were some aspects in the society, like for example, the lawyers what attracted to the movement, and the movement was able to preserve the savings of the people and to create a new track for freedom, starting with the democratic transition. So this movement, as I said, in the revolution, because the revolution didn't have any leadership, but members of Al-Nahda, lawyers and men and women of the Al-Nahda joined the revolution until we reached the elections, and the elections of 2011 led to failing all the attempts to foil the revolution, and we get into the first fair and free elections in Tunisia. The Tunisian people gave their vote of confidence to the Al-Nahda movement through the ballot boxes, and there was 1 million, more than 1,000,000 and 198 voices, which means 36% of the votes, and 89 seats in the parliament from a total of 216 seats. Al-Nahda followed a participatory approach in governance, so they tried to include all parties, including leftist parties, which means that they communicated with all the parties, and they ended up with a troika with Mr. Al-Munsif Al-Marzuqi, who received 20, and his party that received 29 seats in the parliament, and they communicated with Mr. Al-Jafar, whose party received 20 seats. The movement was keen to have participation in the governance, and it tried to have dialogue with everyone and not to coerce anyone to the opinions, although they were the majority in the parliament, but they didn't try to coerce anyone. They were also received the recognition of the international recognition and the local recognition. They normalized with the administration and they received this recognition. This was the most important point, which is to get recognition at the societal level and at the international level. And that was the impression, which is normalization with the administration and integration with the society, and their rejection of violence and extremism. Extremism in Tunisia started to appear after the presence of the moderate Islamic movements in Tunisia. So Al-Nahda tried to curtail the extremist ideology in Tunisia. The Al-Nahda movement participated in several national dialogues. I say that it had a lot of successes, and I'm not going to mention them very quickly because they were mentioned by others, but very briefly, it had successes in the political aspect, in the role of women, human rights, but it didn't succeed in the socio-economic aspects by providing better conditions for the people or making the necessary economic reforms. So this is the Al-Nahda movement during the revolution. The third line, which is very important, the Al-Nahda movement and the theoretical background, which means the relation of Al-Nahda to Islam. We in Tunisia, we have a very fierce and extremist secularism because the colonization tried to deny the people of their identity and replace it with a new identity. After the French army left Tunisia, we had people who were dealing with the France. So that started with the division of our homelands and then the colonization. In Tunisia, we have a very extremist secular movements. So secularization and westernization was very clear in Tunisia. Although the constitution says that Islam is the religion of the state, Tunisia remained a part of the Islamic Ummah, but the westernization and secularization that was instilled in the cultural life, in education, and in the curriculum at schools led to this extremist secularism. From this environment, Al-Nahda movement came out. Its vision in the beginning was built on the Al-Ash'ari Sunni school of thought, mixed with some Maturidi thought and Mu'tazila thought. Al-Nahda is not affiliated to a certain school of thought, but it's taking its sources from the Quran and Sunnah mainly. And in Tunisia, we have the Ash'ariya, Malikiya, and the Sufism of Junaidi. It's taken from the Junaid. The movement, since its establishment, was a renewal movement, but it had three lines going together. The traditional one from Zaytuna University, and we have the Ash'ari Maliki and the Sufi Junaidi, and the line that is rejecting the rejecting of change, or the second one is the one that is taking its background into al-Kawakibi and other reformists in the Arab world, and we have the one from the Muslim Brotherhood. So Al-Nahda movement represents the extension of the reformist movement that was made by Sheikh bin Ashur and other reformists after the Al-Imam al-Shatibi in the interpretation of the purposes of Islam. We have bin Ashur, and then we have others from Zaytuna University. You have 2 minutes left.
نعم يعني انت وقتك هنعطيك كمان دقيقتين.
لا الوقت مازال انا بديت 50 دقيقه.
انت بديت 48 والان الساعه 13 فهذا 25 دقيقه.
I still have time. It's not only 2 minutes. I still have time. Okay, I will try to be quick. Okay, so this reformist movement is built on Islam, and it also took into consideration modernization and quoting from the West,
الاسلام هو المرجعيه العليا مع الاستفاده من طرق
which means that Islam is the higher background, taking also lessons from other Islamic schools of thought. And in the 10th conference in 2016, Al Nahda movement said, especially in that conference, it spoke about the strategic relation between the movement and religion. In that conference, they wanted to divide or to separate the dawah activity from the political activity. And it is built on four pillars: liberating the liberation of the religious movement, the revolution that led to them, and Al Nahda was not pursued by the police or by the security of the country, and trying to separate between the movement at large and the political party that is affiliated to Al Nahda. The third aspect of my paper is Al Nahda and the societal work. There were main issues with the nature of the Tunisian society. It was one of the societies that were influenced by the West the most. The first point was the argument about the background of the constitution. Most of the Arab constitution I reviewed, the constitutions, most of them say that the Islamic Sharia is the source of legislation. That was a point of controversy, and there were demonstrations in the streets to reject that item, because we had a controversy. One party wanted the Islamic Sharia to be the source of legislation, and the others didn't want to see that, and they saw that this was against the civil nature of the state. And some others wanted to marginalize Islam and put it away from the management of the state. The first chapter of the constitution, it says that Tunisia is a civil state, Islam is its religion, and democracy is its system of rule. So Al Nahda accepted that item in order to get over that controversy with the majority of the secular people, but because of doing that, it lost a lot of its popular support in our society. Because of the westernization that affected our society, we had a current within Tunis that is democratic and very strong, and we have also a realistic liberal tendency by the liberal parties, and we have an Orientalist current as well. Most of those who are affiliated to that are lecturers in the University of Humanities, and these differences sometimes lead to uh, sometimes uh, clear statements against Islam, and some of them hidden statements against Islam. Some people see this separation between the dawah and the political is only not real. But when we speak about the Islam as the religion of the state, we mean that this is we don't look at our affairs without the lens of Islam. The other point is the rights of women. For example, the rights of women, the kutab, traditional schools, and uh, the changing the societal aspects, and decomposition of families. We have, for example, the single mothers issue. In Tunisia, we have more than 1,000 delivery of children without marriage. This is the official statistics that we have, and those non-legitimate children, we have a problem of dealing with them now. These are some of the problems that we have within this Tunisian society, and these are one of the tendencies and the currents that I was talking about. So, what I want to say is that Islam was present in some special spheres, but it was absent from the public sphere, and the extremist secularism in Tunisia led to the exclusion of Islam. And Al Nahda was, because it was working in the political aspect, it excluded, or it led to the marginalization of the Islamic discourse in the political life. And for example, the culture, women, and the religious affairs, all of that led to the marginalization of this matter. So the movement recently watered down its relation to its Islamic background, and that led to watering down the Islamic discourse in its action, and that led to losing a lot of the popular support that it had in the beginning. Main conclusions.
I would say briefly in half a page before I conclude that An-Nahda movement was able to provide freedoms, rights of women, and build democracy, and to eliminate all the fears related to community coercion during its time of rule. And it was able to prove that it's able to take power and work with the community. However, while it succeeded politically, it failed socially, and it started to work on partisan considerations at the expense of its own identity. And after 10 years of the revolution, the civilizational project of Al Nahda, in its political meaning, was reduced to its political dimensions without the cultural renewal and revival of society. And after they lost power, we have come out with with zero in our hands, with a lot of anti Nahda sentiment in the community. It actually almost was accused of corruption. It also failed to manage dialogue and internal diversity, and hence lost many of its supporters and figures. I am one of the people who withdrew from the offices of the movement 2 months ago. There is a sort of consensus in the elite of the movement that it requires a lot of self-criticism and radical revision in order to be genuinely reformed, particularly at the level of the leadership, to introduce a new generation of leaders, institutionalize the movement, and democratize decision making and management of resources, human and financial resources, in a framework of transparency. So it needs to review its relation with identity, with its community, with Islam, and what has it gained from taking power, because taking power is but a means to an end, which is to establish the ideology they stand for. So all of those questions are up for revision right now. Thank you so much, Mr. Sahbi. He talked at the beginning that the question is broad in terms of the relation of the movement with the revolution and with the community. So he was brief in his review of decades of dictatorship in the Arab world, and the Arab world has never experienced good governance or independence of judiciary, for example, and that it was that lack of justice that gave rise to the revolution in Tunisia, followed by other Arab states. And the revolution had no leaders and had no specific persons behind it. It was unexpected anyway. And there were economic and social reasons for that revolution. And then they became political issues. The reasons and the demands were related to social justice and human rights. Al-Nahda for decades was struggling against authoritarianism involving Islamists, leftists, and human rights activists. They were subject to uprooting, arrests, and exclusion, and all of those powers and those forces responded to Al-Bouazizi in December 2010. All of those political parties, Islamic parties, the Tunisian Labor Union, in order to resist authoritarianism. The main features of revolution was first that it was leaderless. There was a complete absence of leaders. It was made based on youth, and it was based on a peaceful movement, which was a very positive aspect. And then was the position of the Tunisian army, which protected and guarded the Tunisian revolution. And then they established the coalition and the assembly, the constituent assembly, which was safeguarded the democratic transition. And the Nahda movement has been involved in many movements against Bourqiba and Ben Ali, and has gained popularity for that struggle throughout the 80s and afterwards, particularly in, for example, 1978 elections. And for more than 25 years, Al-Nahda maintained its peaceful, non-violent approach and contributed to paving the way for the revolution against Ben Ali. But the view of the Al-Nahda was bright in the eyes of the people, and their stance and their position was not informed by reprisal and revenge. The Al-Nahda movement started to coin or start its own path through its figures in the revolution until the first elections, which were the first in 2011, which were the first free and fair elections in Tunisia, and they gained 89 seats in the council, and they also led negotiations and reached the Troika and joined the Marzouqi and others and received parliamentarian authority. They were involved in other battles, but then they were recognized nationally and internationally, and extremism erupted only to undermine the moderate tendency. The movement, the Nahda movement, was successful politically but not socially and economically. Its relation to Islam was sometimes undermined with the strength of secularism since the establishment of the nation state and since the time of colonialism and the westernization. In Tunisia, there is a secularized approach that touches on all aspects of life, and Islam is divorced from all aspects of life, despite the claim in the constitution that the state religion is Islam, and it's a rather extreme secular context, and it is in this context that Al-Nahda rose up. It is based on three pillars. First of all, the conventional religion in Zaytuna, and then they also had the Maliki school of thought, as well as the Sufi, and they also had Al-Kawakibi, and the third is the Muslim Brotherhood and Reformist school of thought. So Islam is the supreme most term of reference for the movement. In the 10th conference of the revolution, of the movement after the revolution, there was a separation between the political and the dawah track because of the new dynamic and the recognition, the legal recognition of the movement and the differentiation between the political party and the Islamic movement. Tunisian community was the most affected by the Western society, Western culture, and that's why the identity question was paramount, and there were many struggles in terms of the cultural questions, and at the end the constitution mentioned that the religion of the state was Islam. This was the compromise it made. Nonetheless, it lost much of its popularity, and there was also a liberal school and Orientalist school, and all of those thought battles reflected on the Tunisian community, in which we had problems with extramarital childbirth, women rights, etc. So religion is present in the community, but it's also absented from public affairs, and Nahda, by separating dawah from the political track, contributed to this furtherance of Islamic isolation. So the movement was able to achieve a lot, but lost a lot in return. So to conclude, the Al-Nahda may be a model for its reconciliatory approach, but it was also a failure in terms of economic and social affairs, and its civilizational project was reduced to power struggle and a struggle over governance and over power, and which made it come out as a loser and almost accused of corruption. There are lots of voices calling for reform and democratization and transparency within the ranks of Al-Nahda through a complete review of its relation with society. Thank you, Mr. Dr. Al-Sahbi. Now we move to our commentators. I hope that Dr. Ahmad would start. The floor is yours. You have 10 minutes. Dr. Ahmad Wifal.
هل فقدناه؟ طيب
الأستاذ زهير. We lost him. He was there all the time. Dr. Ustad Zuhair, Mr. Zuhair Ismail, are you there? Yes. Thank you. Greetings to you all. I thank the Center of Islam and Global Affairs. I thank the moderator for his for this invitation, and I also particularly thank the speakers for their valuable contributions. In my comments, I'm going to start with some general remarks, although the time is too short. But we have to say that over the past 10 years, we have to observe the political situation, what has come to be known as transitionology, which is the science of transition, and unfortunately we have little understanding of such transitions, and Tunisia may constitute an addition to this field because its experience is unique in every sense of the word. The three papers what they have in common is that they have focused, of course, on Al-Nahda movement, but the general remark and observation although I don't want to summarize those papers and highlight the important issues, but what I would like to shed light on is a critical point of view. I have failed to see, despite the different perspectives from which the different speakers talked, we hardly saw any critical review from the internal ranks of al-Nahda. Actually, the discourse is almost apologetic, and we, although we can observe that there is almost more than one al-Nahda, this may not be negative in itself, but over those 10 years and over the previous years of struggle, unfortunately, this found no place in the narrative about al-Nahda, and it was reduced by its rivals. Is how much would you pay for 1 kilogram of a struggle against autocracy, which is a sarcastic comment, and eventually it was accused of corruption. Mr. Al-Ajmi talked about the experience of al-Nahda in building democracy, and he talked in a very concentrated sentence, saying that we cannot imagine the relation between al-Nahda and the state before the revolution, except in the context of resistance to tyranny. And he also said that we cannot imagine the relation between al-Nahda and the state apart from the context of the relation with the state after the revolution as a party in power. But what we have to recognize is that I hope I am not mistaken, that we do not seem to be aware enough in the importance and the conditions of democracy. Sometimes when I talk about the figures of al-Nahda, those who struggled for al-Nahda or who produced thought for al-Nahda, they are still talking about Islamic thought, although after 2011 they don't recognize that we have moved from the Islamic project to the democratic project, from the national project to the democratic project, from the communist project to the democratic project. In other words, we have moved from ideologically informed project to the democratic project. And I believe this lack of a common denominator may explain the conflict and the problems that hindered the establishment of democracy and the institutions of democracy. On the other hand, the contribution by Mr. Hassan al-Hassan focused on the school of al-Nahda, what he called the school of al-Nahda. At that level, he mentioned that Rashid al-Ghannouchi could be regarded as a figure of political reform, and this is almost a fair summary of his paper. But in my point of view, I believe Rashid al-Ghannouchi is not affiliated with the Islamic movement or political Islam in its traditional meaning. And Mr. Hassan al-Hassan mentioned his relation with Malik bin Nabi, who himself was not part of the Islamic movement, but he was one of the remnants of the reformist and the Renaissance movement. He has no position or no standing in with the Muslim Brotherhood or al-Nahda. Rashid al-Ghannouchi may be a blend from all of that, but it was also mentioned that he had some visits to the house of Malik bin Nabi, and also he was one of the Beldiya, which in Tunisia refers to a class of people who are more open and aware and who are closer to the tradition of a Nahda and the reformist movement. All of this made the context of the Nahda movement a blend of reform and Islamic thought, and some of it was mentioned by Mr. Sahbi at the end. So the other point, in my opinion, to be brief, is that Rashid Al-Ghanouchi, I sometimes joke with my friends and I tell them you have one person who thinks in Al-Nahda who is Mr. Rashid Al-Ghanouchi. Actually, in this joke, I am more serious than joking, actually, because when we talk about a school of thought in Tunisia, this is a figure of the speech. We could say there is a professor without any students. In other words, most of his students are to his right. So Al-Nahda has witnessed a structural crisis in its relation to democracy. I mean that the inaccurate awareness that the political Islam in its common understanding or common connotation. Jean-Pierre Badouer, the head of a center on the Arab world in the 90s, he said something very important. He said, if the Arabs and Muslims understand that the Muslim and Islamic movement represent the Arab political modernism, they would save a lot of effort. Al-Nahda was not completely aware of those conditions. In an academic article, I mentioned that Islam or the Islamic movement is actually a historic and social phenomenon with a beginning and an end, and I believe that it culminated or it culminates in justice and development, in which I refer to its relation to democracy. So if democracy is established, we will have it will replace political Islam, which is what happened in Turkey when the students, so to speak, dissented from their professor. And also this blending or combination between political and Islamic content was a new attire in which the political party abandoned its terms of reference or its background to a new political gown. But Al-Nahda, in Al-Nahda, we didn't see that the students or the followers of Al-Ghanouchi had their own thought, but it seems that Al-Ghanouchi looks like he was both Erbakan and Erdogan in the Turkish context. So to go back to this coup, if we look at the positive aspect, and unfortunately it's since it is a coup against democracy and constitution, there is no advantage, but it could be and could represent the shock that would revive Al-Nahda from its older perspective to awaken to a new perspective. In other words, the traditional connotation of Al-Nahda has no longer bears any meaning, and I believe it should restructure and reestablish itself in the democratic context. If time allows, I would conclude with a few quick remarks. You have 3 minutes. I believe that Al-Nahda movement, as I was listening to the papers when we were talking about secularism, about westernization, etc., believe my brothers should be aware that we have known no secularism during autocratic rule. Actually, secularism was the demand of many democratic forces as well as Islamists. We had no secularism. We had only autocracy that uses the gown of modernist schools, but it was uh, only a masquerade for autocracy. And also, even westernization, they haven't copied the West and were unable to translate Western thoughts, be it capitalist or communists or national. So I believe that Al-Nahda was actually itself a secular movement that finds it hard to recognize itself as such. And this is something that may take us to a in-depth debate and takes us to Taha Abdul Rahman's article in which he talked about the Unitarian view of the state. In other words, he says that religion has no position in the state itself, and that Al-Nahda, when it was confronted, it wasn't before it was Islamic, but because for the first time it tried to introduce an understanding for religion from outside the state. So in that sense, they were not against religion, but wanted to nationalize religion, so to speak. Bourguiba has nationalized religion and co-opted religion under the state, and this unfortunately was copied in the constitution of the revolution. Hence, there was this struggle between the perception of the movement to religion, and this was one of the mistakes of Al-Nahda when they separated Dawah from the political path. What remained was a movement of revival or renaissance, even without understanding the overall objectives. In other words, they did not establish the prerequisites for transformation, the transformation of religion from text to concepts, from fundamentals to concepts. As you know, the objectives uh, were used at the beginning, but changing the reference texts into practical concepts is necessary, including the protection of human beings, the protection of property, the protection of people. So Al-Nahda continues to be a revivalist movement, i.e., it tries to revive an experience from the past and has not established a new frame of thought. I conclude with a question that has faced the experience in Tunisia. Why has transition survived over 10 years in Tunisia, unlike other areas like in Libya, where we had elections, but we had a relapse afterwards, and also in Egypt, where we had elections and then we had a relapse. In Tunisia, we continued for three reasons. First of all, there is a common understanding of the state despite all disagreements. Also, second is that the security and security apparatus is away from political ambition. The third is that there were two representatives from the old and the new. I mean, Nida Tunis and Al-Nahda, with the other political parties in the elections, and this was not given its own weight, in which we regarded this election as taken for granted to be in favor of the old party, and then goes back in the second cycle of elections to the sorry, the first for the new comers, then it comes back to the old, but then we did not look at this in depth, because what happened is that in addition to the democratic confrontation in the context of the constitution, we had two very critical aspects which represent the conflict against democracy, which is the constitutional free party, and also we have Qais Said, who targeted the constitution. And based on the three conditions which allowed for the persistence of the democratic experience in Tunisia, we had a disagreement on the concept of the state, allowing Qais Said to introduce very strange ideas, so much so that so-called seculars have started to relabel the idea of centralizing power in the hands of a single person, and also they started to provoke the military institution, where the president is trying to provoke the military and co-opt it in his favor. The third point is that we had a demise of the center. As you know, Nida Tunis has fragmented and Al-Nahda is in decline.
بابا ما في هلا، ما في، خلص
more than
قيمي ايدك، قيمي ايدك، حاج
followers
تنشي
to
تنكشفي انفك بقى.
less than 500,000, and the rise of the Dignity Coalition and the Free Constitutional Party, all of those factors indicate clear dangers and warning signs to telling that this experience was non-viable or unable to continue. So this coup thrived on those failures, although this is no justification. Those mistakes do not justify the coup, but they have helped it. So if we look at the relation between
شايفه شلون تمشي على
and
مهلك، خلاص
these
البنزين ما بصير تضل ماشي على مهلك
in
او
the
تكبسي.
democratic experience, we would still see that the Islamic movement represented by Al-Nahda
خليني اجرب.
is the strongest party which can use this opportunity to undertake revisions. And the problem is that Al-Nahda requires recognition from those who are below it. That's not what it needs. It needs to review itself and be aware of the transformations related to the conditions of democracy. And I believe that I would say there is an orientation within Al-Nahda where people are starting to recognize this problem within the ranks of Al-Nahda, and that this review will not infringe or diminish its history or its role in the democratic transition. Rather, it would be a guarantee for the building of democracy. And let me conclude in one word, that it's not true that we have succeeded in the political aspect and we failed in the economic and social aspects. Actually, in Tunisia, we had an economic transition that was conditioned on the political transition. So in other words, the political was the main infrastructure for any other change. And as one author mentioned, political practice very often obscures all that is political. Thank you so much, Mr. Zuhair, for this very important comment. Mr. Ahmed unfortunately is unable to provide us with his comment because of a connection problem. So we have a break to get ready for the next session. We have 4 commentators. I know Dr. Isam, Sabri, the fourth, and the answer. Let's start with Dr. Isam. Please limit yourself to 3 minutes. I'm sorry, but we have very little time. If you have other points, you can keep them for the next session. Peace be upon you all. Thank you so much, Dr. Sami. I would like to thank you all and I thank all the attendees and participants, and thanks to SEGA for organizing such an important initiative in evaluating Islamic movements. I could say that Mr. Ahmed has delegated me to speak for him, but so I will use his 10 minutes, but that's not really true. But the 10 minutes have expired anyway. Anyways, maybe I had the chance to review the text of all 3 papers earlier, and it has given me some relative advantage as opposed to those who were unable to read them beforehand. So my general remarks is that I personally believe it challenging to make a review of an experience that I already regard as a failure. So, for example, anyone would hear me speak and they would say, look at what you have done in your country. We have our peculiarity, we are a different context, etc. This is one of the factors, but the other factor also, I am speaking without much knowledge of all the parties to the situation, to the political arena in Tunisia. The other thing as well is that we are in an academic symposium to evaluate the Islamic movement. However, unfortunately, many of the papers seem to speak in a parallel universe with a cosmetic, apologetic, justifying tone and approach. And most remarks use personal points of view and overgeneralization and exaggerated cosmetic work, so to speak. Since I have read the papers, I have many remarks, some very literal or very specific. For example, in the paper of Mr. Al-Sahbi, throughout the paper, we find reference to adopting a certain line of thought in talking about Al-Nahda, its achievement, its work, until we have in the conclusion, we have 2 conclusions, the 3rd and 4th, that actually undermine everything that has been said in the paper, because he said that after 10 years of the revolution, Al-Nahda was reduced to being involved in the power struggle in a very narrow political struggle, and have failed to have any gains. It almost was accused of corruption and failed to review or accommodate for internal diversity. The 4th conclusion is that there is next to unanimous agreement that the movement requires in-depth revision, internal criticism and review to undertake genuine reform steps in order to institutionalize, democratize. So those 2 conclusions, I have written on them. They evaluate the experience par excellence, and they, in particular, contradict everything else that the author wrote up till that point in that paper. And also, Mr. Hassan, I don't know, at some point when I was reading, I felt that Mr. Rashid Al-Ghannouchi can almost be labeled a prophet. So, to be honest, I felt that if we have all of this potential, if we have all of this faithfulness, why have we failed 10 years on? So we're talking about a Dawa scholar who has given priority to public affairs, and then he gave priority to the battle of the here and now, and we now have 7 months after the coup, not a few hours. Where is this smart management of events, of the here and now, of the turn of events, etc.? And he also says that Arabs have tried the different ideologies used by failed military regimes with nationalist, socialist, and Islamist and fake liberal backgrounds. So they failed, but they did not try the most difficult gateway, which is freedom. But that leaves the question of a dialectic between freedom and Islam, and so is the problem with liberalism, communism, leftism, or Islamism in itself, or in implementation, I wonder. And also there were certain terminologies which I was unable to, well, I could stop anytime. Okay, you have 1 minute. And also the paper by Mr. Al-Ajami, Al-Biraymi, An-Nahda and the State. Under this title, I found nothing, to be honest, because this paper was supposed to be based on an ideological terms, and because this paper failed to address many important issues related to identity, power, government, sovereignty, alliance building, and most of what the paper offered was justification for the failure of the movement over the past 10 years. So it looks like there is a confusion between the concept of the state and the concept of the regime. And this is not only with An-Nahda, but in the thought of most representatives of the Islamic movement in the region. He says that this position in An-Nahda, it moved it from reformist, reconciliatory to revolutionary movement. So was An-Nahda, after the revolution, expecting to build a welfare state? So had An-Nahda continued to rule they remained in power for 10 years, but the nature of alliances they made were one of their failures in themselves. And in another point, he says that this expresses or reflects the balance of power, as it was a provisional compromise waiting for a new cycle of the conflict. This was in 2014, but what happened 7 years later, what happened over the next 7 years? The last remark, okay, in this case, let me move to the last speaker, Dr. Zuhair Ismail, because his comment in itself needs to be commented on. He says that there was a movement from Islamic project to the democratic project. What are you suggesting? Are you suggesting there is a contradiction? And from the ideological to the democratic project, at the end of the day, democracy is an ideology. Democracy in itself is an ideology. So how can we say we're moving away from an ideological project towards democratic projects? He says that Al-Ghannouchi did not affiliate with the Islamic movement and political Islam, but to Al-Nahda movement. How can you then explain that Al-Nahda, which was led and guided by Al-Ghannouchi, be called you have actually taken the time of Mr. Ahmed in complete. Actually, I thank him so much in this case. Okay, we will move to other commentators and then we will go back to our three speakers to respond. Dr. Tariq in 3 minutes. First of all, I would like to salute Al-Nahda and the revolutionary rhetoric and the Arab wise men of the Arab world, Mr. Al-Ghannouchi, who was able to manage this experience over the past 10 years. But it was not clear in those presentations that there was a clear political model that Al-Nahda seeks to establish, and it seemed like the model was what was possible and feasible, regardless of what they set out to do. And there was a lot of theorization in political terms that actually exaggerates the actual performance on the ground. And this political system failed to prevent the return of authoritarianism.
This relation with the society should have brought other duties. With the second marginalization of the religion and separating the dawah from the political activity is a participation to the marginalization of religion in Tunisia, as the Nahda movement stated by itself. And also there was appreciation of the reconciling with other parties and this approach of reconciliation that was followed by Al-Nahda. However, these consensuses and these reconciliations didn't lead to strengthening the democratic model. It rather made this model rather more complicated for others to understand. And this is something that might happen in states in transition, but it made it really difficult for others to comprehend. And at the end, despite all of these problems, it confronted tyranny, and it seemed that tyranny has a very long and deep project, and these steps were made as traps for the revolution that it was dragged into to fall into this trap of tyranny. There was also the international aspect, or the attention to the work of the international relations, but we can't say that it was successful, which means I mean, some of the speakers spoke that Al-Nahda proved itself internationally, or the world cannot exclude it easily. I believe all of the international statements today refer to the fact that you have to bury Al-Nahda today rather than tomorrow. And this is that's what they want to make. Mr. Yasser, go ahead. I'm Yasser Fathi. I'm researching discourse analysis. I would like to thank all the speakers. And for the sake of time, A very simple comment. As a researcher and someone who is interested in the Egyptian issue, I wanted this experience to help us to make a critique of the experience, not necessarily negative critique, but I felt that the suggestion has nothing to do with the events that are taking place. For example, right now, regardless of the hope and regardless of what we want, where is this experience? Another point, Dr. Hassan mentioned among the points is how do we appreciate the movement through the successes and failure? Maybe we can say that one of the successes is that Al-Nahda survived to remain in the political arena regardless of other points. But there are other points of success which is related to the ability to maintain the state, because it was the largest movement and it was supposed to keep or preserve the state. So regardless of its survival, how can we evaluate that it couldn't make, despite its survival, it couldn't maintain those forces or to work together with these forces. So the gains became weak. And what is needed to be in the during transition is to have these alliances that to protect the people and to protect the real movements of transitions. So if we evaluate that, does that make Al-Nahda successful, or do we need something else? And we understand the difficulty of the governance, but people require to have even small successes in order to maintain the transition. But when the leaders of the transition or the experiences in transition don't give anything to people other than the freedom of expression and liberty, it will make it easier for the tyranny to revolt, because the revolution became easy itself. So people will be very easy to follow a popularist discourse in this context. Thank you very much. Thank you. I would like to thank Siga and all the speakers. I will start. In order to evaluate, I need to have a standard to against which I can evaluate that. Now, is the Al-Nahda or the political Islam or the Muslim Brotherhood have the clear strategy with all of its aspects that are clear? I believe that there is a problem. Now, as a researcher in the field, now it's like playing football, for example. If you are playing against Brazil or any other, you know how the Brazil plays and how professional it is, or is it just like to experience and make mistakes? There is no model that we want to lead. We speak about civil democracy, but how do you want to deal with the others? For example, interacting with others. When you have the opportunity, do you seize it or you let it slip? I believe that in the Islamic leadership, we have a problem. When they speak about democracy, we don't find that there is no internal dialogue or no internal implementation of democracy within the movement. And another, the process itself is part of the example. You can't speak about democracy and about the issues, but without dealing with the issue. When you have to deal with democracy, even if you are a leader, you have to follow the process. So, in summary, I believe that the Al-Nahda was great, but they have a lot of mistakes, and we need to learn from. And the same mistakes are repeated in Egypt, in Jordan, in other states. And there is also the lack of thinking, because there are no recommendations provided by think tanks for them. So I believe Al-Nahda should make benefit of those centers, and to have 5 or 10 leaders, or not to have 5 or 10 leaders and they have their own discretion. and they say, well, we did our best, and that's the best that we can do. When you have, for example, some slogans to eliminate poverty or to do other things, how are they related to your overall vision? This is something that should be clear. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now we have a lot of questions and a lot of interventions, and I am aware that we are at a nick of time, but I will give the opportunity for the speakers and try to answer as much as to select which ones you want to answer to, because we need to go to on a break before we start the second session. Dr. Hassan, you have 3 minutes.
نسمع نعم تفضل.
Do you hear me? Yes.
طبعا بإيجاز
Very briefly,
كثير مصطلح
uh, a lot of the speakers or the commentators talked about the failure, and I believe that this is premature. I said in my intervention that the coup was born almost dead, and that it will end soon. However,
هذا أثبتته حتى التجربة
and
التونسية
this was even proven by the Turkish experience. For example, Erdogan started as a head of a municipality in 1997, and then a president in 2012. But nevertheless, or 2014, and then the coup took place at some point later. So the Tunisian experience succeeded in getting a democratic experience where in the last 10 years in a very hard circumstances. There was we were in a race against time, and you know that every year Tunisia spends in freedom. It weakens the possibility for tyranny to get back, and it increases the possibility to go back to democracy. And I believe today we have uh, a promising aspects that democracy will get back, and if we get out of this crisis with real victory, the democratic experience will be stronger. I'm not going to speak about the indicators, but I believe the coup will not last more than a few coming months. But now we can say that the democratic front that is established now should provide a quality vision and make a stronger political alliances to be more lasting and based on clear ideological backgrounds. And I believe this will happen step by step. We need to build the political scene step by step, and I believe that it is being established now or recreated now. And if we get over this scope, I believe that we will be in a political arena that will be distinguished. And we also need institutional legal protection. We need to have an acceptable formula for the groups within the community, because the consensus in the last 10 years didn't allow us to get into the economic agreement. It was avoiding fears, but it didn't make any hope. Of course, the past 10 years, or what we have done in the past 10 years, it was due to the problems and fears that we had. Look at the democracies, for example. The movement from weakness to strength is not a straight line. It is a curved lines and a zigzagging lines. Of course, in the field, we have several players, and those players, if you are if you are playing with those actors alone, so your fight will be very straightforward, but you are dealing with others who are dealing with them. So what I'm saying is that our community is heading toward recovery, and we have a lot of indicators for that. What we are required to do, and the democratic forces in this arena should do better work,
شكرا
and I hope that this will
دكتور
happen
حسن.
soon.
الأستاذ العجمي تفضل.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. Mr. Al-Ajami, you have 3 minutes
شكرا
to respond.
جزيلا.
Thank you very
باختصار
much.
شديد يعني ملاحظه اولى
Very
لتطبيق
briefly, the
الدكتور
first one
زهير.
about the Dr. Zuhair Ismail. You hear me,
مسموع.
right?
نعم.
هل في النهضه مفكر واحد؟
Do we have one thinker in Al-Nahda or not? Once I wrote an article said one thinker is not enough, not only for a political party, but for a state. If we have a philosopher like Kant, for example, who says that the political thinking is divided into two parts, and he created a new line of thinking. So that might be something useful. But what I said that Rashid al-Ghanouchi maybe is advanced upon people from his generation, and he is improving his thinking, and he has improvements. But to say that there is only Mr. Rashid Al Ghannouchi who is thinking, this is not correct. But there is a problem. Although now Al Nahda is over 50 years old, but it started as a young movement, and it is still a young movement, which means that it was established and it was widespread amongst the school students, university students, and when it produced the elites from the university, it was under heavy narrowing down, and that affected the production, the scientific production. Responding to Mr. Isam, who read the paper, and he said that there is confusion between the authority and the regime. I don't think so. Although the suggestion that was provided to me was to give a paper on the vision of a state in the mindset of the Al-Nahda, but my paper was the vision or the relation between Al-Nahda and the state under the democratic system. And here I am not making any confusion, but I am speaking about the political environment in which this relationship took place. And it is a complicated one. For example, the state has, oh, sorry, the army has a state, has a role. And this role is not very clear for all the people, but it is happening in a way that is taking into consideration a lot of factors and is being navigated very smartly. And we hope that the army will continue doing this role. As for Rashid Al Ghanouchi, he is the Speaker of the Parliament, and the Parliament is a main organ of the state, and the state should protect him. Did
لدول الخليج
state
واذرعها
him
معناها
while he was bombarded every day by the media that was funded and supported by some Gulf states? He was not protected, and the parliament was targeted in order to, it was targeted from within the parliament, and the state didn't do anything. It allowed the forces of democracy to work, allowing everyone to practice their own share of influence. And this maybe applies in terms of the relation of Al-Nahda with the state. And the state also wanted to tame Al-Nahda, and Al-Nahda wanted to tame the state. And even more than taming them, the state wanted to to disembark or decomposite the Al-Nahda movement in the States. So Al-Nahda feels that it is still threatened, and there are those who are trying to accuse Al-Nahda that it is a terrorist organization and trying to curtail its work and with all of its membership and their people. Thank you for your comments, and I hope that I will make use of the comments. And thank you once again, Dr. Simon, for the invitation. Thank you, Mr. Al-Ajami. Now, the final remarks will be for Dr. Al-Sahbi, and then we will adjourn this session. Thank you, Dr. Sami, and thanks to all the commentators. Dr. Isam talked about the conclusion, and that is the important thing, because maybe we might have differences in the analysis or the descriptive aspects, but the most important thing uh, were the conclusions, and we are trying to review what happened after what happened in the 25th of July. That's what we are trying to do. We are making revisions, we are making contemplation of what happened. And in the beginning, I provided description and analysis, and the conclusions are the important ones. I would like to thank you for capturing these remarks. As for Dr. Jauhari, Bourguiba doesn't believe in religion. I am not speaking about the history of Bourguiba. He hit Al-Zaytuna and the endowment ministry, and he called for the breaking the fast in Ramadan, and he drank during the day. So, speaking about, and he spoke about the miracle of Moses as one of the myths that the religion speaks about. I'm not going to speak about that. And even talking about that having an Islamic movement in Tunisia at such a time is kind of miracle, because in such atmosphere it was impossible to have any Islamic movement. So the culture and the orientation towards France and the colonization of France that affected uh, our culture, we have seen that during through laws that were passed in the parliament. So it's not a matter of discussion. So they don't want to have any religion, and they didn't empower religion in the country. Maybe they play about that topic in order to have some popularity. But to say, for example, right now, to have any leftist who speak nicely about the human rights abuses, because they are targeting Al-Nahda members. So what we are seeing is a very critical condition that is impacting us. And we are not talking about differences on the constitution, on or based on constitutional matter or discussions. It is just for eliminating, making some or settling some personal positions. We need to have a further discussion and contemplation. But what I'm saying is that we are in a very extraordinary situation, and this experience, with all of its successes and failures, required to be studied more deeply. I agree with some of the comments that were provided, and thank you anyway for the invitation. Thank you very much, and I would like to thank all the speakers and the commentators, Dr. Hassan bin Al Hassan, Mr. Al Ajami Lurimi, and Dr. Sohbi Atiq, as well as the commentators, Mr. Zuhair Ismail and Dr. Isam Abdel Shafi, as well as other commentators. Thank you very much, all. Indeed, it was a rich session. We have had a lot of comments and important comments. The next session, it was supposed to be at 3 o'clock our time, but because we started late a little bit, so we will start late half an hour. So we will start at 3:30 Istanbul time, 1:30 is Tunisia time. See you in the next session of this symposium. Thank you very much.